So, Assalamu alaikum, dear students. What we will do today is one of the most interesting parts of your study in population genetics. It's going to clear out a lot of concepts because we will do natural selection. Selection not of students in a pre-medical test, but selection of species in nature. Basically, selection of characters in nature. Characters that are fit for the environment, they survive, and with changing environment, there are characters that just fall out of place. They do not suit the new, changed ecological and other factors, and then those characters don't have any place, and very ruthlessly, mm, nature just eliminates them, and hence there is extinction and speciation. So, this is, you must remember, one of the five mechanisms of evolution, as we had discussed in the beginning. We also discussed that this is going to be one of the five assumptions of the Hardy-Weinberg law. But first, we will do these mechanisms one by one, and then we will be moving on to Hardy-Weinberg law. So, as you can see, natural selection was the crux of the theory of evolution that was given by Darwin. Uh, it's primarily an attempt to account for adaptation of organisms to their environment. Now, whether it explains not only adaptation but evolution as well is entirely another matter. So, as we had already discussed the mechanisms of evolution, we will be studying natural selection as one of the primary mechanisms of evolution. So, there are, of course, several more like mutation and migration and drift and extinction and adaptation. But we begin with natural selection. So, what happens is that in a long period of time, it may even be possible that the deleterious character is not found in the population. However, this does not mean that it is entirely gone. It is very much present, but then it's in the form of a recessive allele. Now, natural selection is based on the fact that the assumption, let's say, that in nature, within species, there are variations, variability of characters. And this variability of characters is the raw material on which natural selection has to act. So please remember what we are talking about right now is not the difference of characters between two species. What we're talking of right now is not interspecific competition. Let us say we're not talking of competition between a population of tiger and leopard in a given area. What we are focusing on is the variation within, let's say, a tiger population, a leopard population, because as you know, there goes the saying, to each its own, stripes for stripes and spots for spots. So the tigers come with with stripes, and the leopards come with spots. So we are not comparing stripes with spots. We are comparing this design, this pattern, this color of the stripe with a certain set of design and color and pattern of the stripe itself. So, this is the variation on which natural selection acts, and this is the variation where there is this entire struggle for survival, the game of survival of the fittest, and that's how evolution has happened. So, within a population, there may be depending on the environmental characteristics. There may be favorable characters, there may be characters that are not so favored. So, behaviors and physical characteristics are determined by the phenotype, which is, as you know, very simple, high school biology, that which is a product of the genotype. So, whatever a species is doing, whatever the entire population of the species is doing, the way it's behaving, the way it looks, the way it acts, what it eats, how it forages, how it breeds, how it, if in case of birds, how it goes for roosting, everything depends on its phenotype, and this phenotype is defined by its genotype. Now, you know about genotype that these characters are all there on the genes, and on one locus of a gene, there may be two alleles, the dominant and the recessive, and both the alleles are responsible for a different character. And this is what variation is. Variation is the raw material for natural selection. Natural selection selects the favorable trait, and it eliminates the not so favorable trait. And this variation comes from the genes, the two different alleles on a single locus, and all loci, they have various types of alleles. Sometimes there are two, sometimes there are three. There are so many examples. There is eye color, there is blood group, and as you know, all of Mendelian genetics is based on round and wrinkled, green and yellow, you know, the color of the beans and the shape of the beans and how they look. So, this is what variation is. For example, uh, color of body in an insect species. Let us say there is a species of moths, or there is a population of a species of beetles in a given area, and some beetles are green, some are slightly red, or in case of moths, some are dark gray, some are light gray. They could be light green, they could be dark green. So there are differences based on the gene pool within a population. And the organism is suited or not suited to its environment on the basis of this variation. So these are responsible for the traits within a population. Mind it, what I'm saying again and again, and I'm emphasizing, is that there we are not as of now concerned with the difference between the species, the variations in the characters that are present interspecifically. Right now, we are focusing on intraspecific differences, variations within a population. Like I gave you the example of beetles. There may be beetles of two colors, same species beetles of two colors, same species moths of two colors. Now, in a given environment where the beetle is struggling to survive, I mean, it's feeding, it's foraging, it's breeding, and it's trying to enhance, capitalize upon its fitness in the environment, it is also faced with a lot of competition. Competition with its co-specifics, competition with its co-generics, competition with other species, as well as it is faced with a lot of threats from predators. Every environment has predators. Now, the predator species are also doing this for their own survival. I mean, it doesn't look very nice, but that's how nature is. Now, it is a competitive advantage for a beetle to be able to keep itself safe from the predator. And that the beetle will be able to do only when it has those characters in its phenotype which help it to escape the predator or to fight the predator or to simply remain hidden and to evade the predator. But unfortunately, the poor beetle or the poor organism, even we, don't have any control over the genes that we have, and on account of the genes, the characters that are there in our phenotype. Say, for example, the dark beetles, uh, they may have an advantage over the light colored beetles. Why? Because if the environment where they are, the habitat where they are found, it has dark color vegetation, then they will be better camouflaged, and any predator species that is interested in eating them up will find it more difficult to spot them, to find them in the vegetation, and they will have a better survival rate. On the contrary, the light ones, they are easily seen against the background, and they are favored by the birds of prey or any other avian species. There may be storks, there may be egrets, there may be raptors. Uh, but then mm, other avian species that favor them, they are not favored by natural selection, of course, because they will not be able to survive. So certainly, the dark one has an advantage. Now, where is that advantage coming from? It is coming from the genes. And the fact that the dark beetles have an advantage over the green beetles, and the fact there are some dark colored beetles and there are some green colored beetles, is a result of variation. The fact that the stork is easily able to prey upon the green beetles and not so easily able to prey upon the dark beetles is how natural selection is operating upon this population of beetles in a given area. So, natural selection favors the dark beetles while the predator species favor the light ones. So, the dark one certainly has an advantage over the light one. So, that is what selection is: survival and fertility mechanisms that affect the reproductive success of a genotype. They are known as selection. And the extent to which a genotype contributes to the offspring of the next generation relative to other genotypes in a given environment is commonly known as fitness. So, uh, fitness is the selective value or it's the adoptive value. And in other words, selection can be defined as the composite of the forces that limit the reproductive success of a genotype, and we can describe fitness as the comparative ability of a genotype to withstand selection. And when selection process operates, gene frequencies tend to change among generations unless the population has reached a genetic equilibrium. When we are studying the selection coefficient, we will be studying the selection coefficient, the disruptive, the stabilizing, and the directional selections in our consecutive coming two lectures. Then we will be able to better understand as to what is genetic equilibrium. So, this is what natural selection is. When Darwin he was studying uh, the species when he went on that voyage on the HMS Beagle. He was there for 4.5 years. I mean, he was just 22 years old at that time, but quite a lot of discoveries that he made there. So, when he was doing that, he knew that there is intraspecific variation, and this variation is responsible for the emergence of new species, but he didn't know that it's happening because of the genes. So although Mendel and Darwin inhabited the planet Earth together, Mendel was born in 1822 and Darwin was born in 1809, and then Probably Darwin died in 1882 and Mendel died in 1884. So they lived kind of together. But the Mendel was a little unfortunate in this way that during his lifetime, his work couldn't get that shot to fame, which Darwin's work got within his lifetime. So Darwin didn't know about Mendel's work, but then destiny had it that after many, many years, when Mendel was validated, so was Darwin's theory of natural selection, which he based simply on natural observations. But then, with the help of population genetics, and as I told you in my last lecture also, that population genetics is where Darwin meets Mendel. So, with the help of that, this theory is validated. So, this is how, from generation to generation, when changing traits are inherited and they are favored or not favored by nature, simply because of the change in the environment. Say, for example, um, in a static environment, there is this, let's say, moth population, wherein we have two different kinds of moths. Some of the moth individuals of the same species, some of them are light gray, others are dark gray, and they have been like that for thousands of years. But suddenly there is something called industrial revolution. Now you know industrial revolution means combustion of a lot of fuel and a lot of carbon emission, too much smoke in the air. So it's changing the environment. It's changing the environment to such an extent that the barks of the trees on which this beetle population survives, the color of the barks of the trees started changing because of the presence of smoke in the air. And suddenly, the light gray moths, they became more visible to the predators because of the change in the background. So you can imagine if you place a white colored ball on a white colored sheet, it will not be very easily visible. But if you place a white colored ball on a black colored sheet, it will be very conspicuous. So this is what happens to this moth species. And slowly and gradually, uh, this variation results in speciation. So there is a new moth species which is fitter, which has only dark gray individuals, and mm, that's how we have adoptive radiation and fit species. So Darwin, when he gave these theories of adoptive radiation and of natural selection, he didn't know where is this variation coming from. This we learned much later when Mendel's findings were properly popularized, and also when all the doubts and aspersions cast on Mendel they were laid aside, and that we will see when we do the Hardy-Weinberg law, how and what happened. So there are many causes of the variation. It can be mutation, it can be drift, it can be migration, it can be chromosomal mutation, it can be genetic mutation. Um, so the mutation creates variation, and unfavorable selection mutations they get selected against, while the reproduction and mutation and the favorable mutations they are more likely to survive. So what happens over a period of time, over several generations, is that the deleterious genes, when we call it a deleterious gene, at that time when the environment has changed and that gene is no more fit for that environment, so the deleterious gene slowly and slowly reduces, it diminishes, and more reproduction takes place with these favored genes. That means the species is becoming more and more fit for the new environment. Now, what is fitness? A concept that you need to understand. Uh, when we say fitness, Darwinian fitness, it's very different from what we generally perceive as fitness. It's not about the individual. It's not about how strong an individual is. It's not about how well it can feed and forage, or it's not only about how well it can mate. Uh, it's an outcome of the number of offspring that the individual, the population, the species can produce, and um, it's also an outcome of the survival of that offspring up to the age of reproduction. That is what we call fitness. So, in the biological sense, fitness is not about how long an individual of a species lives, but it's about how numerous its offspring are and whether they are viable, that is, whether they reach the age of reproduction themselves. So it depends on survivorship as well as fecundity, and fitness of a species is relative to the environment, and all factors within the environment count for the competition and survivorship. So, other individuals with the species count for the relative fitness of an individual, and then, of course, this is what leads to speciation. But we are going to do speciation also in some of our subsequent lectures. Okay, so this is what fitness is, and right, where from are these characters coming? There is something called randomness. Random. I hope you understand and you appreciate the meaning of this very mesmerizing term, random. Something that happens without any rhyme or reason. Natural selection has a big reason behind it. If the character or the trait is fit, it's selected. If it's not, it's selected against. But the cause from which this character is coming, that cause is 100% random. A species cannot will for a particular character. If once a beetle is born, and even if it realizes that being light green is dangerous, it's deleterious, it can neither change its own color, A, nor it can produce offspring that are of the color that this beetle wills. It's completely random as to what kind of variation will arise when DNA duplication is taking place as a product of mutation. What kind of variation will arise? There is absolutely no rhyme or reason why a particular character emerges. So it's a very bottom up effect. It's not a top down effect that okay, the giraffe felt that being tall is good for him, so the giraffe stretched its neck up. No, no, not at all. There was a mutation, or there was the emergence of this character of a tall neck in a giraffe at random, without the giraffe willing, without anyone thinking or giving it a hang that this giraffe needs to survive, so let's give him a long neck. No, it hasn't happened like that. The giraffes, the ones who had a long neck, they had a better chance to survive. So they eliminated those which had a shorter neck. That's what it's all about. So species and individuals are subjected to natural selection all the time, but they can't will to be subjected or not, and neither they can will for a particular suitable trait. So it's just like a game of dice. You know what you want, but you can't get what you want by trying for it. You are simply depending on chance. So, this is very important when you try to understand the emergence of variation and changing environments. Certainly, they are a reality. Environments keep changing. There are multiple factors in the environment which provide a living condition to a species and its population. So some are suited to its phenotypic character, but they may transform in future and no longer remain suited. So this leads to extinction. And also, speciation takes place if a good portion of favored allele is transferred in the F2 and onwards. Again, we will be seeing this gene equilibrium and selection coefficient and that will be in the fourth lecture. In the third lecture that comes after this, we will be doing the modes of selection. So we have already discussed industrial revolution. So before I leave you with natural selection, I will leave you with a little thought on the modes of selection. You know, the crux of Darwin's natural selection was continuous variation. But just like some aspects of Darwinian evolution were proven wrong, pangenesis, say, for example, it's not a part of neo-Darwinism. It had to be laid down and it had to be shunned. So, but Darwin thought that pangenesis is the process through which the characters are transformed from one generation to the other, because Darwin had simply no idea about genes. He knew that the characters are inherited, but he didn't know how. He didn't know what factors are responsible, and he didn't even claim. So, just like pangenesis has been proven wrong, similarly, I'll not say the continuous uh, variation has been proven wrong, but it has been challenged. And soon after Darwin had proposed natural selection by continuous variation, it was Francis Galton who challenged continuous distribution, and he had proven it in the lab and with empirical data and with population genetics, with what you're doing. I'll leave you with this example. So, what Galton proposed was that parents who undergo very sharp variation, they do not transfer it to their offspring. See, for example, what we have here is a chart on stature, height of people. Uh, there is a larger frequency of those people who belong to the average height group. As you can see, the average height group, it veers around 1.7, 1.6, I mean between 1.64 to, let's say, 1.76. Very short people, 1.58, and very tall people, 1.8. I mean, this is just data, but then you can imagine they're less frequent. So there is something called an average, um, a gene for an average trait in a population. Now, suddenly, if in a particular generation uh, there is a variation in an individual who is very, very deviated from the average, say, for example, someone born in a population is very tall, really tall, he's, let's say, 7 feet long. It is not necessary that all the children that he gives birth to now, or all the children in his successive generations, F2, F3, F4, will also be very tall, will also be 7 feet long. So, this is where Galton proved that no, variation may not be continuous, it can be very sharp and it can be very, very discontinuous. So, normally, if you draw the curve of this data that we presented in the previous slide, yeah. So, this is the quantification of the trait, and this is the original population. On this population, natural selection is acting. So, as long as there is a gene equilibrium, there will be no speciation. But when, because of mutation or any other factor, there is a variation in the character, gene equilibrium changes and the environment also changes. So much so that the environment starts acting upon that trait, selecting it or selecting against it. Then this bell shaped curve of a normal distribution, in which is the most prevalent curve that is found in nature, then it might shift. Then it might shift. But then this will, of course, happen only when a large proportion of the population undergoes that change, and that will result in speciation. And that will explain why there are so many different kinds of species in this world. So, this is all about natural selection. I hope some of the doubts have been cleared. I hope if there was any confusion as to whether natural selection is about competition between species or not, uh, these doubts have been cleared. So, thank you so much and happy learning. Bye bye.